The winter of 1938 arrived early in Ashford Hollow, a forgotten township nestled in the cold, dusted valleys of western Pennsylvania. By late October, frost had already claimed the last of the garden vegetables, and a perpetual fog hung over the narrow streets like a burial shroud. The town itself was dying. Half the mining operations had shut down after the crash of '29, and those who remained did so out of stubbornness or lack of options. The houses leaned into one another, like exhausted travelers, their paint peeling, their foundations cracking under the weight of too many hard winters. On Mercy Street, at the far edge of town where the paved road dissolved into dirt and gravel, stood a two-story clapboard house that seemed darker than the others. Not because of its color, it was the same weathered gray as most homes in Ashford Hollow, but because of something intangible, an absence. The windows reflected nothing, even on the rare days when sunlight broke through the clouds. The small front porch sagged in the middle, and the yard was overtaken by wild grass that rustled in the wind with a sound like whispered warnings. This was the Caldwell house, and in the autumn of 1938, it became the center of something unspeakable. Margaret Caldwell was 32 years old that fall, though she looked older. Her face carried the kind of weariness that comes not from years but from accumulation, loss layered upon loss, disappointment stacked on disappointment. She was tall and thin, with dark hair she kept pinned back severely from her face, and eyes that seemed perpetually focused on something just beyond whatever room she occupied. Those who knew her, and there were few, described her as peculiar. She rarely spoke when she came into town for supplies, moving through Morrison's general store with mechanical efficiency, selecting items from the shelves without meeting anyone's gaze. She paid in exact change, counted out carefully from a small cloth purse, and left without pleasantries. But it was her children that people noticed most. Thomas was 9 years old, a slight boy with his mother's dark hair and a tendency to flinch at sudden movements. His younger sister, Lily, was 6, with pale blonde hair that seemed to belong to a different family entirely. The children appeared infrequently, usually trailing behind their mother at a careful distance, never speaking, never playing with the other children who might be on the street. "Those kids," Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the postmistress, would say while sorting mail, "there's something wrong there. You can see it in their eyes, like they're looking at you from the bottom of a well." The Caldwell family had moved to Ashford Hollow 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1935. They came from somewhere out west, Ohio, some said, though others insisted it was Indiana. Margaret arrived with her 2 children and no husband, which in itself raised eyebrows in a town where propriety still held firm, despite economic devastation. When asked about Mr. Caldwell, Margaret's response was always the same, delivered in a flat monotone. "He passed. The influenza." No one pressed further. Death was common enough in those years. Mercy Street had only 7 occupied houses in 1938, and the residents formed the kind of loose community that exists in dying towns, not quite friendly, but bound together by proximity and shared hardship. They noticed things about one another. They talked. The Hendersons lived 3 doors down from the Caldwells. Frank Henderson worked the night shift at the last operating mine, and his wife, Ruth, kept house and raised their 4 children. Ruth was the type of woman who noticed everything: a missing newspaper, a light left on at an unusual hour, voices raised behind closed doors. And she noticed the Caldwells. "There's cooking smells from that house at the oddest hours," Ruth told her husband one evening in early November as they sat at their kitchen table, the radio playing softly in the background. 3, 4 in the morning sometimes. I can smell it when I get up to check on the baby. Frank grunted, more interested in his coffee than neighborhood gossip. "And those children?" Ruth continued, lowering her voice despite being in her own home. "I never see them play. Not once. They just stand in that yard sometimes, still as statues, like they're waiting for something." "Maybe they're just quiet kids," Frank offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ruth shook her head. "It's more than that. Last week I saw the boy, Thomas, standing by their back fence in the rain. Just standing there, soaking wet, staring at nothing, for near about an hour. And when his mother finally came out to get him, she didn't call to him or nothing. Just walked up and took his arm, and they went back inside. No urgency, no concern, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Frank frowned. You think someone should check on them? Check on them how? Knock on the door and ask if everything's all right? Margaret Caldwell doesn't exactly invite conversation. That was true enough. Margaret had made it clear from the day she arrived that she desired no friendship, no community, no interference. The message was received. But still, people watched. What made everything stranger was that Margaret Caldwell, who barely spoke a word to her neighbors in 3 years, suddenly began inviting them to dinner. It started in mid-November, just after the first real snow. Mrs. Dorothy Keene, a widow who lived 2 houses down, was the first to receive an invitation. She found it slipped under her door one morning, a simple card with neat handwriting. You are invited to supper this Saturday at 6 o'clock, the Caldwell home. Dorothy was surprised but intrigued. She'd been curious about the Caldwell family since they arrived, and this seemed like an opportunity to finally understand the strange woman and her silent children. That Saturday, as the early winter darkness settled over Mercy Street, Dorothy walked the short distance to the Caldwell house, carrying a small apple pie she'd baked as a courtesy. The house looked no more inviting up close than it did from a distance. The porch steps creaked under her weight, and when she knocked, the sound seemed to echo inside like a stone dropped into an empty well. Margaret answered almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting just behind the door. Mrs. Keene. Please come in. The interior of the house was dim, lit by only a few oil lamps despite the early hour. Dorothy could make out a modest parlor to the left, furniture covered in what looked like bed sheets, and a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. The air inside was warm, almost uncomfortably so, and carried a heavy, rich smell that Dorothy couldn't quite place. Cooking, certainly, something with meat. But there was something else underneath it, something faintly sweet and cloying that made her swallow reflexively. The dining room is this way, Margaret said, her voice as flat and emotionless as ever. Dorothy followed her through a short hallway into a small dining room where a table had been set for 2. The children were nowhere to be seen. Are Thomas and Lily joining us? Dorothy asked, taking the seat Margaret indicated. They've already eaten. They retire early. The meal that followed was strange in its normalcy. Margaret served a stew, thick and dark, with chunks of meat and vegetables, along with fresh bread and butter. The food was well prepared, even delicious, and Dorothy found herself eating with genuine appetite, despite her nervousness. Margaret barely touched her own plate. She sat across from Dorothy, hands folded in her lap, watching her guest eat with an expression that might have been satisfaction, or might have been something else entirely. The conversation was minimal and awkward. Dorothy asked polite questions about Margaret's life before Ashford Hollow, about her plans for the winter, about the children's schooling. Margaret answered in brief, vague sentences that revealed nothing. And then, just as Dorothy was finishing her second helping of stew, Margaret said something that made her pause mid-bite. It's important to take care of one's neighbors, don't you think, Mrs. Keene? To feed them, to nourish them. We're all we have in times like these. There was something in the way she said it, the emphasis on certain words, that sent a small chill down Dorothy's spine despite the warmth of the room. Dorothy left shortly after, thanking Margaret for the meal and declining a second invitation with vague excuses about a prior commitment. As she walked home in the cold November night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been profoundly wrong about the evening, though she couldn't articulate what. The stew sat heavy in her stomach. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret extended similar invitations to other neighbors. Frank and Ruth Henderson received one. So did old Mr. Tomlin, who lived alone at the end of the street. Each invitation was accepted out of curiosity or politeness, and each dinner followed the same pattern. Margaret serving generous portions of rich, well-prepared food while barely eating herself, minimal conversation, and that same heavy atmosphere that seemed to press down on her guests like a physical weight. And always, the children were absent, already asleep, or eating in the kitchen, or not feeling well. Ruth Henderson mentioned to Dorothy Keene after her own dinner that she'd heard sounds from upstairs during the meal, not the normal sounds of children playing or settling down for bed, but something else. Scratching, perhaps, or whimpering, like an animal in distress. But when she'd asked Margaret about it, the woman had simply said, "Old houses make all sorts of noises," and changed the subject. The neighbors began talking among themselves, comparing notes. The dinners themselves were fine, good even. Margaret's cooking was excellent, surprisingly so. But there was something off about the whole situation, something that didn't add up. "When's the last time anyone actually saw those children?" Mr. Tomlin asked during a chance encounter at the general store. The question hung in the air, unanswered. On December 3rd, 1938, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, Ruth Henderson woke to the sound of a scream. It was high-pitched and brief, cut off almost as soon as it began, as if someone had clapped a hand over the screamer's mouth. Ruth sat up in bed, her heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. Silence. She rose and went to the window, pulling back the curtain to look out at Mercy Street. Most of the houses were dark, but the Caldwell house showed a light in one of the upstairs windows, a flickering orange glow like candlelight or lamplight. As Ruth watched, a shadow passed across the lit window. Then another. The shadows seemed to be moving in an odd way, jerky and unnatural. And then the light went out, and the house returned to darkness. Ruth stood at the window for another 10 minutes, but nothing else happened. Eventually, the cold drove her back to bed, though sleep was slow to return. In the morning, she mentioned it to Frank, who shrugged it off as a dream, or perhaps a fox in the woods behind the houses. "Those animals can make sounds like a woman screaming," he said. "It's unsettling, but natural." Ruth wasn't convinced, but she let it drop. As December progressed and Christmas approached, life in Ashford Hollow continued its slow, grinding routine. The mine worked. The snow fell. Families prepared for the holiday with whatever meager resources they could muster. But on Mercy Street, a question began to form in the minds of several residents, a question that none of them quite wanted to voice aloud because of what it might mean. When was the last time anyone had actually seen Thomas and Lily Caldwell? Not heard about them, not heard sounds from the house that might be them, not been told by Margaret that they were upstairs or in the next room, but actually seen them, looked them in the eye, confirmed their physical presence. Dorothy Keene, thinking back over the past weeks, realized with growing unease that she hadn't laid eyes on either child since early November. At least 6 weeks, maybe longer. Ruth Henderson couldn't remember seeing them since before Thanksgiving. And old Mr. Tomlin, when pressed, admitted he couldn't recall seeing the children at all since summer. The invitations had stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Margaret no longer came to the door when neighbors knocked. The house on Mercy Street seemed to have closed in on itself, becoming even more isolated and impenetrable than before. But those cooking smells Ruth had mentioned, those continued. Rich, heavy smells that drifted from the Caldwell house at odd hours, carried on the winter wind to the neighboring homes. And somewhere in the back of each neighbor's mind, a terrible possibility was beginning to take root, a possibility that was too monstrous to speak aloud. Not yet. But soon, someone would have to knock on that door. Someone would have to ask the question directly. Where were the children? End of Chapter 1. The investigation that would shock a nation was about to begin. But the truth hidden behind the walls of the Caldwell house was far more disturbing than anyone in Ashford Hollow could have imagined. December 15th, 1938. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and Mercy Street lay under a blanket of fresh snow that muffled all sound. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray columns that disappeared into the overcast sky. It was the kind of morning where everything felt suspended, waiting. Ruth Henderson had barely slept. For 3 nights running, she'd lain awake thinking about those children, about the dinners, about that scream in the darkness. She'd tried to convince herself that Frank was right, that she was letting her imagination run wild, seeing shadows where there were none. But the feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. That morning, as she prepared breakfast for her own children, she made a decision. She would go to the Caldwell house. She would knock on that door, and she would ask to see Thomas and Lily with her own eyes. "I'm going with you," Dorothy Keene said, when Ruth mentioned her plan later that morning. The 2 women had met at the general store, and Ruth had confided her intentions in a hushed voice between the canned goods aisle and the flour barrels. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Dorothy interrupted firmly. "I've been thinking the same things you have. We both go, or neither of us goes. There's safety in numbers." By early afternoon, the 2 women stood on Margaret Caldwell's porch, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Ruth raised her hand and knocked, 3 firm raps that echoed louder than she'd expected in the winter silence. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. "Margaret?" Ruth called out, her voice carrying an edge of authority she didn't quite feel. "Margaret Caldwell, it's Ruth Henderson and Dorothy Keene. We need to speak with you." A full minute passed. Ruth was about to knock a 3rd time when they heard it, the sound of a lock turning, then another, then a chain being slid free. The door opened just wide enough to reveal Margaret's face, pale and drawn, her dark eyes moving from Ruth to Dorothy and back again. "Yes?" Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. "We're sorry to disturb you, Margaret," Ruth began, trying to keep her tone friendly and concerned rather than accusatory. "But we haven't seen Thomas and Lily in quite some time, and we wanted to make sure everything was all right, that the children are well." Margaret's expression didn't change. "They're fine." "We'd like to see them," Dorothy said, more directly than Ruth had dared. "Just to say hello. It's nearly Christmas, after all." Something flickered across Margaret's face. Annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. "They're not here." "Not here?" Ruth felt her stomach tighten. "Where are they?" "Visiting family. Out in Ohio. They left 2 weeks ago." The lie was so smooth, so readily delivered, that for a moment Ruth almost believed it. Almost. "That's wonderful," Dorothy said carefully. "Which family members are they visiting? We didn't realize you had people in Ohio." Margaret's jaw clenched slightly. "My sister. I don't see how that's any of your concern." "Of course it's not," Ruth said quickly, trying to salvage the conversation. "We're just being neighborly. Making sure everyone on the street is doing all right during the hard winter." "We're fine." Margaret began to close the door. "When will they be back?" Dorothy asked, placing her hand on the doorframe. Not aggressively, but enough to prevent it from closing completely. Margaret stared at Dorothy's hand for a long moment, and something in her eyes made Dorothy want to pull it back. But she held firm. "After the new year. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." This time, she did close the door firmly, and they heard the locks engaging one by one. Ruth and Dorothy stood on the porch for a moment, looking at each other in the dim afternoon light. "She's lying," Dorothy whispered. "I know," Ruth replied. "But what can we do?" Ruth Henderson's next stop was the Ashford Hollow Schoolhouse, a single-room building at the center of town where Miss Adelaide Foster taught all grades from 1st through 8th. Miss Foster was a spinster in her 50s, severe but fair, who'd been teaching in Ashford Hollow for nearly 30 years. Ruth found her after school hours, cleaning the chalkboard while the last rays of winter sunlight slanted through the tall windows. "Mrs. Henderson," Miss Foster greeted her with a nod. "What brings you by?" "I have a question about the Caldwell children, Thomas and Lily. When did they last attend school?" Miss Foster set down her eraser, dusting chalk from her hands. Her expression grew troubled. "The Caldwell children have never attended this school, Mrs. Henderson." Not once in the 3 years that family has lived here. Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Never? But surely. Don't the truancy laws— I've inquired about it, Miss Foster said, her voice dropping. Twice, in fact. The first time, Mrs. Caldwell told me she was teaching them at home, which is permitted under certain circumstances. The second time, she didn't answer the door. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Between you and me, I've had concerns about those children for some time. But without evidence of actual wrongdoing, there's little I can do. The county superintendent barely has resources to manage the schools that exist, let alone investigate homeschooling situations. What if something's wrong? Ruth pressed. What if those children are in danger? Miss Foster met her gaze steadily. Then perhaps it's time to involve Sheriff Mackenzie. Sheriff Thomas Mackenzie was a large man in his early 60s, with a thick gray mustache and the weary demeanor of someone who'd seen too much of human nature's darker side. His office occupied a corner of the town hall, a cluttered space that smelled of old coffee and pipe tobacco. He listened to Ruth's concerns with increasing skepticism, occasionally grunting or nodding but offering little in the way of commentary until she'd finished. Let me make sure I understand, he said finally, leaning back in his chair until it creaked. You want me to investigate Margaret Caldwell because you haven't seen her children lately, and because she served you dinner, and because her house smells like cooking. Put that way, Ruth had to admit it sounded thin. It's more than that, Sheriff. It's the way she acts, the things she says, the fact that those children have never been to school. The scream I heard, which you said yourself might have been an animal. It might have been, but what if it wasn't? Sheriff Mackenzie sighed heavily. Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your concern for your neighbors. Truly, I do. But I can't go barging into someone's home based on suspicions and feelings. I need evidence. I need probable cause. Those children could be hurt, or worse. Or they could be exactly where Mrs. Caldwell says they are, visiting family in Ohio. He held up a hand before Ruth could protest. But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll make a visit to the Caldwell house myself. I'll ask to see the children, and if Mrs. Caldwell can't produce them or provide adequate proof of their whereabouts, then we'll take further steps. Fair enough. It wasn't what Ruth had hoped for, but it was something. When? Tomorrow morning. First thing. Sheriff Mackenzie arrived at the Caldwell house at 9 o'clock the following morning, December 16th. The sky was heavy with the promise of more snow, and his breath formed thick clouds as he climbed the sagging porch steps. His knock was authoritative, the knock of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. Margaret answered more quickly this time, as if she'd been expecting company. She wore the same dark dress Ruth had seen her in the day before, and her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Sheriff Mackenzie, she said evenly. How can I help you? Morning, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm here on a welfare check. There's been some concern expressed about your children, Thomas and Lily. I'd like to see them, please, just to confirm they're well. They're not here, Sheriff. They're visiting my sister in Ohio. I explained this to Mrs. Henderson yesterday. So I heard. Do you have an address for this sister? A way I could contact her to confirm the children's arrival? Something hardened in Margaret's eyes. Am I being accused of something, Sheriff? Not at all, ma'am. Just doing my due diligence. You understand? Children's welfare is a serious matter. My children are perfectly well cared for. I'm sure they are, so if you could just provide me with that contact information. I don't have to provide you with anything, Margaret said, her voice still level, but with steel beneath it. Unless you have a warrant, Sheriff. This conversation is over. Mackenzie studied her for a long moment. He'd dealt with difficult people before, with people who had things to hide. But there was something about Margaret Caldwell that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just her resistance. It was the complete absence of normal maternal anxiety. Most mothers, when questioned about their children's whereabouts by law enforcement, showed at least some concern about why the questions were being asked. Margaret showed nothing. "I don't need a warrant to ask questions, Mrs. Caldwell, and I don't need to answer them. Good day, Sheriff." She closed the door with finality. Mackenzie stood on the porch for a moment, considering his options. He could force the issue, could threaten to return with a warrant. But on what grounds? A woman's refusal to answer questions wasn't a crime, and without evidence of actual wrongdoing, no judge would grant him a search warrant based solely on neighbor concerns and a mother's unfriendly demeanor. Still, as he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in that house. That night, Ruth Henderson couldn't sleep. Again. She lay in bed next to her snoring husband, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind howl around the corners of the house. At 1:15 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely. She rose, wrapped herself in a thick robe, and went to the kitchen to make tea. As she waited for the water to boil, she found herself drawn to the window that faced toward the Caldwell house. It was dark, as expected, but as Ruth watched, a light appeared in the upstairs window, the same window where she'd seen the flickering glow on the night of the scream. This time, the light was steady, like a lantern or electric lamp. And then she saw movement. A shadow passed across the window, and then another. But these shadows were wrong somehow. Too large. Moving in ways that didn't match normal human movement. Ruth pressed her face closer to the cold glass, straining to see more clearly through the darkness and the distance. The light moved, as if someone was carrying a lamp from one side of the room to the other. And in that brief moment of movement, Ruth saw something that made her blood freeze. A silhouette. Definitely human. But the proportions were all wrong. The arms too long, the posture too hunched. And it seemed to be dragging something. Something heavy that scraped across the floor. Then the light went out again, plunging the Caldwell house back into complete darkness. Ruth stood at the window for another hour, but the light didn't return. When she finally went back to bed, she knew sleep would be impossible. Because she'd made a decision. Tomorrow she would gather the neighbors, all of them, and they would demand answers. Whatever was happening in the Caldwell house, it was going to end. By noon on December 17th, 8 residents of Mercy Street had assembled in the Henderson living room. Ruth had gone door to door that morning, and the urgency in her voice had been enough to overcome the usual reluctance to get involved in others' affairs. Frank Henderson was there, reluctantly. Dorothy Keene sat on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Old Mr. Tomlin had hobbled over with his cane, wheezing from the cold. The Pritchards, Eleanor and her husband George. Young Jimmy Walsh, who'd just turned 18 and worked at the mine with Frank. And Mrs. Beatrice Cole, whose house shared a property line with the Caldwell's backyard. "Thank you all for coming," Ruth began, standing in the center of the room. "I know this is unusual, but we believe, that something terrible might be happening in the Caldwell house, and that those children might be in real danger." "The sheriff already looked into it," George Pritchard pointed out. "What more can we do?" "The sheriff knocked on the door and accepted Margaret's word that the children are in Ohio," Ruth countered. "But none of us believe that, do we?" Silence. Then Dorothy spoke up. "I don't believe it. Those children never went anywhere. I would have seen them leave." "So would I," Mrs. Cole added. "My kitchen window faces their driveway. No one's come or gone from that house in weeks except Margaret herself, and only for brief trips to town." "What exactly are you proposing?" Frank asked his wife, though his tone suggested he already knew and didn't like it. "We go there, all of us, and we don't leave until Margaret lets us see inside that house. If the children are in Ohio, she should be able to prove it. If she can't..." Ruth let the implication hang. "That's illegal," Frank said flatly. "That's trespassing, at the very least." "Those children could be suffering," Dorothy shot back. "Or worse." "Are we really going to stand by and do nothing because we're worried about property laws?" The debate went on for another 30 minutes, voices rising and falling, consciences wrestling with caution. But eventually, a consensus emerged. They would go to the Caldwell house. They would knock on the door, and if Margaret refused to let them in, they would call the sheriff again and refuse to leave until he took action. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, as the winter sun began its early descent, 8 residents of Mercy Street approached the Caldwell house together. Their footsteps crunched in the snow, and their breath created a small fog around the group. No one spoke. Ruth led the way up the porch steps. She raised her hand to knock. Before her knuckles touched the wood, the door swung open. Margaret Caldwell stood in the doorway, backlit by the dim interior of her house. She looked different than she had in previous encounters. Her hair was disheveled, her dress wrinkled and stained. Her eyes, always dark and distant, now had a wild quality to them, like an animal backed into a corner. "What do you want?" Her voice was raw, stripped of its usual flat affect. "We want to see your children, Margaret," Ruth said as firmly as she could manage. "We want proof that Thomas and Lily are safe. I told you, they're in Ohio. Then show us a letter from them, a telegram. Something." Dorothy stepped forward. "Or let us into your house to see for ourselves that they're not here." Margaret's lips pulled back from her teeth. Not quite a smile, not quite a snarl. "You have no right." "We have every right to be concerned about children's welfare," old Mr. Tomlin spoke up, his voice reedy but determined. "And we're not leaving until you give us some answers." For a long moment, Margaret stared at them, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stepped back and pulled the door wider. "Fine," she said softly. "Come in. See for yourselves." The invitation, when it finally came, was somehow more terrifying than her refusal had been. The group exchanged glances, uncertain. This was what they'd wanted, wasn't it? Access to the house. A chance to find the truth. So why did every instinct scream at them to turn around and run? Ruth took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold. The others followed, reluctantly, crowding into the narrow entryway. The house was even dimmer inside than it had appeared from outside, despite it being mid-afternoon. And that smell, the rich, heavy smell that had drifted to neighboring houses for weeks, was overwhelming up close, so thick it was almost visible. "The children aren't upstairs," Margaret said, gesturing toward the staircase. "You're welcome to look." Frank and George headed up the stairs, their footsteps heavy on the old wood. The rest waited in the entryway, avoiding Margaret's gaze, trying not to breathe too deeply. They could hear the men opening doors upstairs, moving through rooms. After several minutes, they returned, shaking their heads. "Empty," Frank reported. "The children's bedroom looks like it hasn't been used in months. Dust on everything." "I told you," Margaret said. "They're not here." "What about the cellar?" Mrs. Cole asked suddenly. "Have you checked the cellar?" Margaret's face went very still. "There's nothing in the cellar." "Then you won't mind if we look," Ruth said, emboldened by the woman's obvious discomfort. "I mind very much. You've seen the upstairs. Now I want you all to leave." But Ruth had already spotted the cellar door. A narrow wooden door tucked under the staircase, held shut with a simple latch. Before Margaret could move to stop her, Ruth crossed the room and pulled the latch free. The smell that rushed out when the door opened was indescribable. It was the cooking smell, but concentrated and twisted into something else entirely, something rotten and sweet and wrong. Several of the neighbors gasped and stepped back, covering their mouths and noses. "Don't," Margaret said, and for the first time, there was something like panic in her voice. "Don't go down there." But Ruth was already descending the stairs, one hand on the rough wooden railing, the other covering her nose. Dorothy followed behind her, then Frank, then the others, drawn by horror and necessity in equal measure. The cellar was dark except for thin streams of daylight coming through a small window near the ceiling. As Ruth's eyes adjusted, she began to make out shapes in the dimness. A large table, stained and scratched. Shelves lined with jars and containers. A coal stove in the corner, still warm, and hanging from hooks on the far wall. Ruth's scream shattered the silence. End of Chapter 2. What the neighbors discovered in Margaret Caldwell's cellar would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The final chapter reveals the full, horrifying truth of what happened in the house on Mercy Street. Ruth Henderson's scream brought the others rushing down the cellar stairs. What they saw in that dim, fetid space would be seared into their memories forever, images that would wake them gasping in the night for years to come. Hanging from hooks on the far wall were sections of meat, wrapped in cloth and butcher's paper. On the table lay cutting implements, knives of various sizes, all meticulously clean. The shelves held dozens of mason jars filled with preserved something. In the dim light, it was impossible to tell what, but it was the trunk in the corner that had made Ruth scream. It sat partially open, and from inside, a small, pale hand was visible, fingers curled slightly, as if reaching for something that would never come. Frank Henderson moved first, crossing the cellar in 3 long strides. He threw open the trunk completely, then staggered backward, his face draining of all color. Inside lay the bodies of Thomas and Lily Caldwell. The children were arranged carefully, almost peacefully, dressed in their Sunday clothes. Their skin had a waxy, unnatural quality, and their lips were slightly parted, as if they'd been caught in the middle of speaking. But their eyes were open and staring at nothing, clouded with death. Dorothy Keene began to sob. Old Mr. Tomlin sank onto the bottom step, his cane clattering to the floor. Mrs. Cole crossed herself and whispered a prayer. And behind them, at the top of the stairs, Margaret Caldwell spoke in that same flat, emotionless voice. "I told you not to go down there." What happened next unfolded in a kind of terrible slow motion. Frank Henderson, moving on pure instinct and fury, charged back up the stairs toward Margaret. But Sheriff Mackenzie had arrived, summoned by Jimmy Walsh, who'd run to fetch him the moment the group entered the Caldwell house. The sheriff took one look at Frank's face and pushed past him, descending into the cellar. What he saw there made him, a man who'd served in the Great War and thought he'd seen the worst of humanity, turn away and vomit into the corner. "Margaret Caldwell," he said, wiping his mouth and climbing back up the stairs, "you're under arrest for the murder of your children." Margaret didn't resist. She didn't run. She simply held out her wrists for the handcuffs, her face as blank as a winter sky. As Mackenzie led her out of the house, she spoke again, and what she said would become one of the most chilling statements in criminal history. "They weren't wasted. I made sure they weren't wasted. That would have been the real sin." Within hours, Ashford Hollow was transformed from a forgotten coal town into the center of a media firestorm. Reporters arrived from Pittsburgh, from Philadelphia, from as far away as New York City. The house on Mercy Street became a crime scene, cordoned off with rope and guarded by state police. The investigation that followed revealed a horror that went far beyond what the neighbors had discovered in that cellar. Medical examination determined that Thomas and Lily Caldwell had died approximately 8 weeks prior, sometime in mid-October. The cause of death was poison, specifically arsenic, administered in small doses over several days. The children had suffered immensely before finally succumbing. But it was what happened after their deaths that truly shocked investigators. Margaret had butchered her children's bodies with the precision of an experienced hunter. She had removed organs, separated muscle from bone, rendered fat, and preserved everything in various ways, salting, smoking, canning. Nothing had been wasted. And then she had served them, the stew that Dorothy Keene had eaten at that first dinner, the roast that Ruth Henderson had praised, the meat pies and the rich broths that Margaret had provided to her neighbors over the course of several weeks. All of it had contained flesh from Thomas and Lily Caldwell. When confronted with this evidence, Margaret showed no remorse. Instead, she seemed confused by the investigators' horror. "We were starving. she said simply during her interrogation. What else was I supposed to do? As detectives dug deeper into Margaret Caldwell's history, a picture emerged of a woman who had been broken long before she came to Ashford Hollow. Her real name was Margaret Elizabeth Thornton. She'd been born in rural Indiana in 1906, the youngest of 7 children in a desperately poor farming family. Her childhood had been marked by hunger, not the mild discomfort of missing a meal, but the gnawing, constant starvation that reshapes a person's relationship with food, with survival, with morality itself. At age 16, she'd married Henry Caldwell, a factory worker 10 years her senior. The marriage produced 2 children, Thomas in 1929 and Lily in 1932, but little else. Henry was a violent drunk who spent most of his wages on bootleg liquor. The family moved frequently, always one step ahead of debt collectors and angry landlords. In 1934, during one of Henry's rages, Margaret had fought back. She'd struck him with a cast-iron skillet, intending only to stop him from hitting young Thomas. But the blow had fractured Henry's skull, and he died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. Margaret had fled with the children, eventually settling in Ashford Hollow, under the story that Henry had died of influenza. For 3 years, she'd survived on odd jobs and charity, but the Depression had made survival nearly impossible. By the fall of 1938, with winter approaching and no money for food or fuel, Margaret had found herself facing the same demon that had haunted her childhood: starvation. A psychiatrist brought in to evaluate Margaret's mental state described her as suffering from what he called famine psychosis, a condition he'd observed in survivors of the Great Famine in Ukraine and other mass starvation events. The constant threat of hunger had fundamentally altered Margaret's psychology, creating a mindset where survival justified any action, no matter how abhorrent. She doesn't see what she did as murder, the psychiatrist reported. In her mind, she was solving a problem. The children were going to starve to death anyway. This way, at least they served a purpose. At least they kept others alive. The logic was insane, but it had its own terrible internal consistency. The trial of Margaret Caldwell began on March 3, 1939, in the county courthouse. It lasted 2 weeks and was covered by newspapers across the nation. The prosecution called it the most disturbing case in Pennsylvania history. The defense argued for insanity. The neighbors from Mercy Street were called to testify. Dorothy Keene broke down on the stand while describing the dinner she'd eaten at Margaret's table. Ruth Henderson had to be excused after she began hyperventilating during cross-examination. The memory of what they'd unknowingly consumed would torment them for the rest of their lives. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy reports. The analysis of the preserved remains found in Margaret's cellar, the testimony of the medical examiner who'd identified human tissue in the jars and containers. But the most damning evidence came from Margaret herself. Against her attorney's advice, she insisted on taking the stand. And there, in front of a packed courtroom, she calmly explained her reasoning. "I loved my children," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I loved them more than anything in this world. But I couldn't watch them starve. I couldn't watch them waste away crying for food I couldn't provide. So I made a decision. I gave them peace. And then I made sure their sacrifice meant something. I fed the neighbors. I kept people alive through the winter. That's what a mother does. She sacrifices for others." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. "Do you feel remorse for what you did?" the prosecutor asked. Margaret considered the question seriously. "I feel remorse that it was necessary," she said finally. "I feel remorse that we live in a world where a mother has to make such choices. But do I regret the choice itself?" She paused, then shook her head. "No, I don't." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, an elderly man named Howard Brennan, who'd presided over countless cases in his long career, delivered the sentence with visible difficulty. He sentenced Margaret Caldwell to death by electric chair. But before the sentence could be carried out, something unexpected happened. On the night of April 12, 1939, Margaret Caldwell was found dead in her cell at the state penitentiary. She had fashioned a noose from her bedsheet and hanged herself from the bars of her window. She left behind a single note, written in her neat, careful handwriting. To those who ate at my table, I'm sorry for the deception, but not for the act. You survived the winter. That was my gift to you. To my children. I will see you soon, and I hope you can forgive me. To the world, judge me as you will, but remember that hunger makes monsters of us all. The note was sealed as evidence and never shown to the public during Margaret's lifetime. But years later, when the case files were finally opened to researchers, it would become one of the most analyzed documents in criminal psychology. The house on Mercy Street stood empty for 2 years before finally being torn down in 1941. No one would live there, and no one would buy the property. Even the address was eventually changed. The street was renamed, and the lot where the Caldwell house stood was turned into a small park, though no children ever played there. The neighbors who'd eaten Margaret's food struggled with the knowledge of what they'd consumed. Dorothy Keene became a recluse, rarely leaving her home. Ruth Henderson moved her family to Ohio within 6 months of the trial, unable to bear living on the street where it had all happened. Old Mr. Tomlin died of a heart attack less than a year later. Some said of a broken heart. The case sparked national debate about poverty, mental illness, and the limits of maternal instinct. Sociologists studied it, psychologists analyzed it. And for decades afterward, the Caldwell case was cited in textbooks as an extreme example of what desperation could drive a human being to do. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case was this. Margaret Caldwell had been right about one thing. The winter of 1938-1939 was one of the harshest on record in western Pennsylvania. Food was scarce, fuel was scarce, and survival was a daily struggle. Several people in Ashford Hollow did indeed die that winter, mostly the elderly and the very young, victims of cold and hunger. But on Mercy Street, where Margaret had served her terrible meals, everyone survived. The neighbors she'd fed, unknowing participants in her horror, made it through to spring. Whether this made her actions better or worse, more forgivable or more monstrous, was a question that would never have a satisfying answer. Today, more than 8 decades after the events of 1938, the Caldwell case remains one of the most disturbing in American criminal history. The town of Ashford Hollow barely exists anymore. The last mine closed in 1967, and most of the residents moved away. The few buildings that remain are ruins, slowly being reclaimed by the Pennsylvania wilderness. But the story endures. There are podcast episodes dedicated to it, true crime documentaries that recreate the events, books that attempt to understand Margaret Caldwell's psychology. And every year, a handful of dark tourism enthusiasts make the journey to what used to be Mercy Street, standing in the empty lot where the Caldwell house once stood, trying to imagine the horror that unfolded there. The case raises uncomfortable questions about poverty, about mental illness, about the breaking point of human morality. It challenges our understanding of maternal love and the survival instinct. It forces us to ask, what would we do faced with the same impossible choice? Where is the line between victim and monster? Margaret Caldwell crossed that line. Whether she was driven there by circumstances beyond her control, or whether some darkness within her had always been waiting for the right conditions to emerge, we'll never truly know. What we do know is this. In the winter of 1938, in a dying coal town in Pennsylvania, a mother made a choice that would haunt a nation. She chose survival over morality, practicality over conscience, and in doing so, she created a nightmare that would never be forgotten. The neighbors who survived that winter carried the weight of what they'd unknowingly done for the rest of their lives. They'd eaten at Margaret's table, they'd praised her cooking, they'd accepted her hospitality, and in accepting it, they'd become part of the horror themselves. That, perhaps, was Margaret Caldwell's true legacy. The understanding that under the right circumstances, anyone could become complicit in the unthinkable. That the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we'd like to believe. That hunger, real hunger, can turn good people into something else entirely. And that sometimes, the most disturbing monsters are the ones who believe, right up until the end, that they were doing the right thing. The end. This case remains open in the files of the Pennsylvania State Police, classified under solved but never fully understood. The names of the victims, Thomas Henry Caldwell and Lily Marie Caldwell, are inscribed on a small memorial stone in what used to be Ashford Hollow, a reminder that even in our darkest stories, we must never forget the innocent lives that were lost.